Um, so I just wanted to thank everybody for coming into the second presentation of our new lecture series on a harmony of interests, inquiries into the true nature of the American system. The fact that this is the 5th of July, I'm glad that we're starting this cycle at this moment, because the confusion about what America is probably at its maximum, not only for Canadians or Europeans or South Americans watching this, but also Americans themselves, as we see every day when we turn on the news and we see chaos ravaging the republic, and a lot of confusion about what is the cause of the ills plaguing the world today. Many good-hearted people who are just fed up have come to the conclusion that they should just join a mob and tear down statues and essentially undo the Constitution itself as their very short-sighted solution. And because of their mob mentality, they don't really see how they're being used by higher forces, which when one looks at history all the way back to the fall of the Roman Republic, one can, and it's useful to look at Shakespeare's warnings in Julius Caesar at this, one can see that this has been something that has both plagued humanity and has been used by tyrants for a very long time. This is not a new George Soros phenomenon. So the need to think for oneself, to be a sovereign citizen, which means to be somebody who can awaken within themselves Platonic powers of inquiry, paradox formation, hypotheses formation, and resolution. This is like a precondition for any republic, any durable nation to succeed. All of the individuals within it have to aspire to that self-perfectibility, which really does embody the essence of the character of the American Constitution. What it was meant to be is an unfinished sort of symphony. So what Anton Chaitkin, I'm going to say a couple of words here just as introduction. Anton has been, has lived a life dedicated to the cause of what America was designed to be by the best ideas of its founding fathers throughout his entire life. As a researcher, as a political organizer, Anton has written innumerable articles, several best-selling books, including Treason in America, the unauthorized biography of George Bush, which, as far as I know, I think probably exposed the depths of the Bush family and the entire Wall Street, City of London support for Nazism and fascism in the 1930s and 40s. Anton is in the midst of producing a new book, which will be published very shortly, the first of 2 volumes, called Prometheus in America, From Kennedy to Franklin. Some of the samples can be seen and read on Anton's website. I'm having the good fortune of also cooperating a little bit with Anton in composing a couple of cartoons that I just found out about today in that upcoming book too, which I'm looking forward to. So Anton, I think with those short remarks, I'm going to leave the stage to you and let you do your magic.
Thank you. I think that the most efficient thing I could do would be to convey a few of what I think are the scoops. You know what that means in journalism, where it's something that you publish, you find out your discovery ahead of other people and get it out to the public. So in this book that should be out within a couple of months, I have some scoops. Starting with the premise, establishment economics says that progress occurs when societies are ready for it. And by that logic, they can keep society from advancing by saying they're just not ready for it. If you talk about, or say Argentina, it would be nice if they got development, but they have too many debts, so have to put that off. That sort of thing. But and that the wealthy are supposed to decide how to invest society's resources. And left out of that logic is the element of intent by humane and talented leaders to cause sweeping progress. This book shows that only such intent has caused human progress in the last several centuries. And so hopefully it's going to dispel many lies about about history, about some of the more important aspects of history beyond the simple idea of the power of evil men. So I want to go through a few of the chapters and just bring up some of the scoops that are in there. And then, you know, we could discuss those things. The first chapter is about the beginning of what's called the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century in England. And it was led by the breakthroughs to change society for the better were led by British friends and collaborators of Benjamin Franklin. There were no capitalists who were investing strictly for profit who did these advancements. The results of this really joint initiative by a circle of people, Franklin's friends, were the steam engine, Britain's canals, the modern steel industry, precision machinery, and the discovery of fundamental biochemical secrets of nature. This all occurred in the 1760s, 70s, and 80s. Hold on a second. I'm just doing a presentation. Can I call you back? Okay, thanks. Okay, bye. That's my picture lady. So the men who made these breakthroughs, we're talking about people like Wedgwood, Bolton, and Watt, Joseph Priestley, Wilkinson, the steelmaker, paid good wages. They sided with the American rebels, including building cannons for the French to convey to the American efforts at Yorktown. And they made these beautiful establishments. But under the British imperial system, people went on to make very cruel factories where they used innovations that were not designed by these inventors and first leaders. And then the British made the determination that no other country would have these breakthroughs, this power. And they adopted a new regime in England, led by Lord Shelburne, to stop other countries from getting the industrial progress that Britain had just gotten. Now, if you imagine, you think about coal mining as it was obviously a very important addition to the wealth of mankind, but the conditions of coal mining were hideous in England. And later on in other countries as well. In the US, it became pretty bad later. But you had children as slaves in England in these coal mines and in clothing factories. It was also a part of a global system of impoverishment in the British Empire. So you ask the question, I want to put this question. Hold on a second. Why was cruelty to the poor a norm in England? Why was cruelty to other countries a norm? How did this become normalized? What is the idea there? I'm not just talking about philosophy. War as a way of life. These are abnormal human conditions. They've happened many times in history, but it's certainly not. It's the ugly, it's the hideous, ugly side of human nature. So you have to ask about the rule in England, about the governance in England. you see that England was not governed by England. You know that about Canada, but I'm saying that about England as well, that there was a British Empire that ruled other countries, but that empire also ruled Britain. The rule over Britain was transnational. Part of it was in the imperial apparatus, which was international, or it might have been, you know, you could say it's located in London as a city, but not in England per se. The monarchy was actually imposed internationally. The financial system was Anglo-Dutch and Venetian and continental European in many ways, but there was a sort of a meta establishment ruling England. And that's the problem. So what's the opposite of that? Men have fought for the opposite of that, which is all throughout history, which is that the government is only legitimate, that is there for the benefit of the people of the country. Benefit means improvement. It means nothing else. It means improvement of the condition and of the people and their conditions. So this idea, this fight for improvement is what the Republicans are all about throughout history, and in that sense, the improvements of the Industrial Revolution are entirely a product of Republican intervention in history and in economics and in technology. I can say that without any threat of credible, you know, somebody differing with me in any credible way, because there is no credible account of the origin of modern history. I'm trying to create one here in this book. Karl Marx and Adam Smith both have silly notions about this. That it was the freedom of capital to do what it wanted, freed from the guild system and from regulations and restrictions from, under feudalism, that allowed for investment in modern industry based on profit making. And this is just, there's no account of the intentions of the people who made the changes, who made the inventions, who did the entrepreneurship. And in every case, there's an intention to improve society, to improve conditions, whether it's through the government or through just an enterprise. And most often it's both of them at the same time, using the same people. In chapter 2, you have this new regime in England led by Lord Shelburne. And I go through the origin of his money in Ireland and in India, his family money. He sets up a new British intelligence system, combining private and public governance and intelligence into one regime, which we've had ever since. And that's the Eastern establishment in the United States, and it's the British establishment today. They were immediately pitted against Ireland. The first thing they faced after this new regime in England came in after at the end of the American Revolution, when they said that they knew they couldn't hold on by force. So they got rid of the old regime that was doing the war against the Americans and said, we'll deal with Americans through other means. And they immediately had to launch assault against Ireland and France. So I go through the Irish Rebellion at that time, which was coordinated with the American Rebellion, and it was based on the demand for protectionism for Irish manufacturing. So this is a scoop that I've got. This is where Matthew Carey comes from. He was the activist there and the leader of that revolt, or the programmatic side of that revolt. Then in America, chapter 3, I have the core of the nationalist core of the American Revolution, a group mostly in Philadelphia and in the field with Washington. And it's in this period during the American Revolution that Thomas Jefferson began to betray the ideals that he expounded in the Declaration of Independence. And he went over to defending Southern interests. And I go through a pretty credible and logical reason why he did that, based on his career collapsing as governor. You can get into that if you want to. But so he began that betrayal in the later stages of the revolution. I'll skip this. Yeah, you have the, go on to chapter 5. It's a unique account of the French Revolution. It's thought to be the first ever publication of the details of the British hand in turning the French Revolution to anarchy and mass bloodshed. And I go through the cast of characters, the team from London and from Geneva that were wielded by Lord Shelburne and Jeremy Bentham and others. And it was in this context that Jefferson went into a several months long tutoring session set up by Lord Shelburne personally, who sent Adam Smith's executor and biographer, Douglas Stewart, to France, who prepared Jefferson in France while he was American ambassador there, succeeding Franklin. Jefferson was prepared by Shelburne's apparatus and this guy, Douglas Stewart, to go back to America and attack the nationalists who were trying to put together a new country. In chapter 6, I present the fight between Hamilton for his program as Treasury Secretary, the founding Treasury Secretary, the founding program, the fight against that by Jefferson and Madison. And the sort of high point of this is the meeting on the Slave Hill in Virginia at Jefferson's plantation, meeting between Jefferson and Madison, where Madison agrees to be turned against nationalism. He had been a stalwart, ally of Hamilton and Franklin and the American nationals and Washington in getting the Constitution through. He didn't write the Constitution, as he's falsely considered to be, because he changed sides later on. That's why the enemy likes to say he wrote the Constitution, because later on he was against, the nationalist economics. But he turned, and Jefferson was the who had just himself been schooled by the Shelburne apparatus and Adam Smith economics for Southern interest in conjunction with British interests. He turned Madison, and Madison begins attacking Hamilton, who was astonished that Madison is now attacking him. There's a great intervention by Franklin at that point in the Congress, the last act of Franklin's life. He introduced a petition calling for the abolition of slavery right then, 1789, 1790. Forget where the date. But that was to show up what Madison and these guys were actually up to, that they were not fighting for human rights in their populist denunciation of Hamilton, but were promoting an imperial slave system. I go through the devolution and collapse of the founding republic in the late 19th century, late 18th century, into this two-party mess. Jefferson attacking, and then some Federalist allies of Hamilton, or so-called allies, forming a fake opposition to Jefferson, which is then pro-British. And so the whole program, founding program, is sabotaged. And it takes another generation before the US is industrialized. Just a few more points here. So the nationalist movement of the 19th century began in 1807, when there was an attack by a British ship, warship, on an American naval vessel, the Chesapeake, right off the coast of Virginia. Unprovoked attack, and they kidnapped American sailors. And that riled up everybody. And so the best American leaders started a nationalist movement to revive the original founders' ideas at that point. And I've chosen 6 individuals as the people that I have figured out are the leaders as a team who carried out the industrialization of the United States. And that's 3 statesmen, which is Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and DeWitt Clinton. The national banker, Nicholas Biddle. The writer and political organizer, Matthew Kerry. And the army officer, Joseph Gardner Swift, who's the second superintendent of West Point. Those 6 worked together in so many different ways. They held many official positions, but unofficially they worked together as a team. So I'll just go through a few of these scoops, and then we can have a discussion. So leading up to the War of 1812, there was an Indian Confederacy out in the Midwest that had been put together with British military and support and advice, American Indians, led by Tecumseh, an Indian warrior, and his brother, whose name means the prophet. And they had a headquarters at an Indian village called Prophetstown, ultimately known as Tippecanoe. And there was a big battle there just as the Congress was considering taking measures against British attacks on our American ships. This is I can't remember now, it's in the book, 1811, I guess. The leader of this, Tecumseh, was later made a British general and died in battle in Canada during the War of 1812. So this is particularly interesting for Canadians to get a slightly different sense of what the stakes are and what's going on in the War of 1812. This is a terror route from Canada, which was shut off by the American success, the limited American success in that war. Another scoop here is John C. Calhoun, who in this earlier period of the 18 teens and early 20s was a leading American nationalist working with Henry Clay to build up US industry and protectionism and so forth, and the military. He later changed, and I've never seen an account before I put this together of how they got him to change. There was a whole terror that was launched in South Carolina, where he's from, based on phony slavery, a phony slave conspiracy to murder white people. And all the political leaders were told, you either join us in suppressing this, this slave danger, and fighting for Southern interests or you're out. So he changed to save his career. I have a scoop about the intelligence work of Nicholas Biddle and John Quincy Adams when Biddle was Secretary of State, and I'm sorry, when John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State before he was president, and Biddle was a presidential advisor for President Monroe. Biddle and Adams worked together on two aspects of intelligence. One of them was British intrigues in South America with phony revolutionaries and false flag terrorism, and trade war. So economic policy and trade policy, two aspects of strategic intelligence, and the two of them were partners. At the same time, Nicholas Biddle did the initial work to get the U.S. coal industry going. This is before he was president of the Bank of the United States. Matthew Kerry started the protectionist movement in the United States in the period of 1819, when there was a depression, a terrible depression in the country because of unimpeded British imports and the bad management of the Bank of the United States. And so in that crisis with mass unemployment, it could have gone either way. There was hatred of the government. It sounds similar to today when people were looking anywhere for a leader. And he is famous, Kerry was famous for showing that following the road that either party has followed would be completely fatal. In this thing, there's a wonderful quote, which I want to give you, if I have time for this. He directly challenged the public to think outside the mental prison set up for Americans by the imperial establishment, a call for moral courage that's urgently relevant now. So let me read you this thing. As a preliminary step, this is Matthew Kerry, who was an Irish revolutionary who went into exile in America and helped promote the development of the Constitution. Then he became a Jeffersonian because he was opposed to the Federalist foreign policy, but he was for Hamilton economics, and he revived Hamilton economics in the early 19th century. So this is his plea to the public in this period, that we need to have strong national efforts with tariff laws and other things to build up our industry. As a preliminary step, we propose to establish the utter fallacy of some maxims supported by the authority of the name of Adam Smith, author of The Wealth of Nations, but pregnant with certain ruin to any nation by which they may be carried into operation. This writer stands so preeminent in the estimation of a large portion of Christendom as the Delphic oracle of political economy. And there is such a magic in his name that it requires great hardihood to go against him and a high degree of good fortune to get a patient and fair hearing for the discussion. But at this enlightened period, we trust our citizens will scorn to surrender their reason into the guidance of any authority, whatever. So he's saying you have to ask, is a theory or a proposition supported by reason and common sense and fact? Or is it just supported by the great names? In the long catalog of wild, ridiculous, and absurd theories on morals, religion, politics, or science, which have domineered over mankind, there's hardly one that hasn't reckoned among its partisans men of the highest celebrity. We hope, therefore, that our readers will bring to this discussion minds wholly liberated from the fascination of the names of the writer, and the determination to weigh the evidence in the scales of reason, not those of prejudice. So think about global warming today and how it's not just that people surrender their minds to supposedly prestigious scientists saying that this is a threat. They don't even know any scientist. They don't know. They've never even heard the name of the scientist that they're surrendering their reason to. It's that bad. And that's what he's addressing here with the economics. And then he does the same thing with Thomas Jefferson. He says, "There's a magic in great names which renders their errors highly pernicious. That Jefferson is truly a great man is now, I believe, universally admitted. But he has had no small degree of instrumentality in giving currency to the system we have pursued. That is, agrarian free trade that's ruined us." And he goes on to say that Jefferson has made a distinction between the beautiful agrarian life and manufacturing that has terrible conditions for workers, and that so he's fostering a prejudice against manufacturing, says Kerry. So here's what he says: "Mr. Jefferson was born, brought up, and lived in a slave-holding state, a large portion of the industry of which is devoted to the culture of tobacco, one of the most pernicious kinds of employment in the world. It more completely exhausts the soil and debases and wears out the wretched laborer than any other species of cultivation. How, under such circumstances, he could have drawn such a captivating picture of the labors of the field, it is difficult to say." So he's pretty bold. I'll just mention the background of some of these people. All of those 6 people that I mentioned are tied to the American Revolution. All of them are in a tension with other members of their society. Henry Clay, for example, from Virginia, later in Kentucky, was anti-slavery, and he's living in a slave state. He was himself schooled by a great Platonist teacher who schooled him in classical literature, Aeschylus, and the moral grandeur of the world's the formation of the world's humane ideas. So this is the background of Henry Clay, and really of all 6 of these men that I brought up, who are the leaders of this transformation that occurred in the 1820s to build up the industry. What do? They set up West Point. All these people working together set up West Point as a school of engineering. America otherwise had no qualified engineers. The federal government's military academy. They passed a law allowing the military engineers to plan railroads. The first great railroads in the United States were built with government funding, usually state or local, but also federal grants. They were private companies, and they were designed, the railroads were designed by Army engineers. I go through the first one, B&O Railroad, which was entirely a community project. So the whole concept that people have of these enterprises and the railroads of the United States being the product of Wall Street and robbers is completely backwards. These are the people in Wall Street who later took over railroads they hadn't built and destroyed them. They set up a foundry at West Point, which produced the first locomotives for American railroads. It was called the West Point Foundry, and its leaders, the founders of that factory, were largely friends of the writer Washington Irving, a patriotic American writer, a famous short story writer. These men developed the entire canal system the Erie Canal, the Midwestern canals, the canals inside of Pennsylvania that brought out the coal, and that opened up the West. And they built the first railroads as projects of the nationalists in the United States. The last thing, one of their projects was to build the first railroad in Russia. I have a big section on that. That was Russia's first railroad, went from Moscow to St. Petersburg. That was in the 1840s. And then the last section of this book is about the adventures of Alexander Dallas Bache, great grandson of Benjamin Franklin, who was a scientist himself, an army engineer, and he went over to after he'd left the army, and he was a professor in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was the center of the nationalism. He went over on a mission to Germany, met with the leading scientists there, Humboldt and Gauss and Weber. And they had this furious clash with the British. The British took away the Constitution of Hanover and expelled and exiled professors from Göttingen University right at the time that Bache had gone there. So these scientists, the American Bache and these German scientists, set up a worldwide brotherhood of scientists called the Magnetic Union. Its formal program was to set up observatories to measure the Earth's magnetic field. But it was a brotherhood of scientists and progressive leaders. And Bache then put together an organization in the United States called the Lazzaroni, which is Italian slang for beggars, an ironic term. They also call themselves the Florentine Academy. And these are the leading scientists in the United States in the pre-Civil War period. They put together the modern Navy, the steel industry, the chemical industry, and the first experimentation that led to the development of public electricity. So this is the nationalist effort and the humanist effort, first in England and then in America, that brought about modern times really in the world, completely opposite to the sense of that accomplishment that you get in the phony study of economics. So that's pretty much it.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Anton.
Thank you, Anton. Thank you so much. So how much time do you have for Q&A? I mean, I know you've gone through so much material. How much time?
Go ahead.
Okay. Huh? Well, yeah. Christine just wanted to know first, before I ask the first question, and I'm sure everybody's got a lot in their minds to ask you. You went through so much, and it's hard to even decide. She just wanted you to just say when you hope that this book will be released and available for purchase. I think that's also a question on everybody's mind as well.
I'm hoping that it will be in about 2 months. We're in the final stages of editing. We have to bring in pictures, and we have to put in things like the index.
Okay.
It's got 1,000 footnotes, and it's really all put together. But the editing process is very, very detailed. It has to be really tight because otherwise it's going to come under attack. And why give the enemy an unnecessary advantage? So I'm hoping in 2 months I probably will do it through Amazon. They publish paperback books as well as the Kindle. They're already selling the Treason book on Kindle. So the Treason in America and George Bush, the unauthorized biography, are both basically copyrighted through EIR. This is mine, and so I'll be you know, in charge of it, and I'll get the royalties, whatever. But anyway, I'm hoping that we can get around containment through various things, not just advertising, but you know, help from people who think that this kind of thing is necessary. The quotes that I've got in here from authorities, British, you know, characters as well as American patriots and stuff. Some of the quotes are so delicious that it will bring. I'm hoping that it will bring a lot of historians to embarrassment. How come they didn't do this? You know, it's from the National Archives, it's from established sources, from the government. It's not just, you know, you read things that they give you quotes and you can't look up and see, well, is that a real quote? Don't you see that a lot? You know, anyway, so yeah, 2 months.
Cool.
I'm
if
hoping.
anybody would like to pose a question to Anton, just keep in mind that your
Yes,
microphone
I
has
would
to be
like.
on.
I would like. This
Okay.
is John.
All right, we'll give John the first question.
Anton.
And then Dave, I know, has a question too.
Yeah. Thanks for your presentation. I was fascinated with the connection of Franklin's grandson, Bache is his name?
Great grandson, yeah, Alexander Dallas Bache.
Bache, with the Göttingen 7.
Yes.
And you mentioned Humboldt and Gauss and Weber, but Weber's been erased from history.
I guess so. I mean, there's a beautiful statue of Gauss and Weber together.
Yes, I saw it last time I was in Göttingen. It's a beautiful statue, and the two together, they invented the telegraph, and Weber was the primary theoretician of electricity of the 19th century, and his work was plagiarized by James Clerk Maxwell, who sort of tweaked it so that it doesn't make any sense, but it sort of works. And so even Germans don't know about Weber's work.
Yeah, I would look on the bright side, though. If you think about what Gauss and Weber did, they did develop a telegraph, and they themselves were working off the earlier work of the American Joseph Henry, whose work was publicized by Bache and by Silliman and went over to Europe. Gauss and Weber were really excited by Joseph Henry's work. Gauss was avidly pro-American. He was an advisor to the Coast Survey, starting back in 1819. So what we're talking about here is in 1830s. They're working at Göttingen University. And if you look on the bright side, the telegraph that was developed by these men in America and in Germany was developed further by a couple of Englishmen, Wheatstone, I think his name, and some other guy. I forget the two names. I have them in the book. But they worked off of these advancements, this earlier work, and also Morse did. And the two Englishmen and Morse did very effective work. But this was the pioneering work that was done. Joseph Henry did the first motor, way before, half century before Edison did the first public electric station. But Gauss and Weber, their collaboration was astonishing, was great. And their work together was broken up by the British and by this terror that the British imposed in what you call the Göttingen 7. 7 professors who signed a petition in 1837 against the revocation of the Constitution of Hanover by the king. The King of Hanover was the brother of King George III of England. And he revoked the earlier, more liberal constitution and made everybody subjects instead of citizens. And so these 7 professors, including the brothers Grimm, who were professors there, they signed this petition, and they were all kicked out of the university, and 3 of them were exiled. And British troops were sent, and it was just at that point when the British troops were sent in to the university to surround it, to stop demonstrations, that Beish arrived to meet under this condition of terror, to meet with these guys. So they had previously set up this magnetic union, Magnetische Verein, and with the help of Humboldt and also a British scientist, the hell's his name? Oh my God. He actually worked in Canada. He was actually fighting in the British forces in the War of 1812 against the United States. But he was a very good scientist in Britain. He was part of this magnetic union. He helped set up magnetic.
Michael Faraday? No.
No. Faraday was a punk compared to this guy. Anyway, I forget the name. But also, what's his name? Humboldt convinced the Tsar to set up these magnetic observing stations all over Russia. And they were set up in South America by Beish's comrade Gould, who was an astronomer down there. So yeah, Gauss and his work and Weber are, you know, there's a good book about it, The Titan of Science. But I think a lot of new stuff should be done. This whole idea, this whole story of this group and what's around it, especially in connection with the development of modern times. That's the key thing, as far as I'm concerned. Not simply that they had a different point of view about science than you know, John Locke or Newton, which is true, but they made the modern world. So this is what you've got to bring out. And they were collaborators in England, which is, I think, a very interesting thing. They're similar to what was earlier that I covered in my book. In the 19th century, Herschel and Babbage and some other scientists were very good. And in reaction to this scientific current, you have these devils like Huxley, who go to work to try to get fascism in the world.
And they start with the ideology of Lyell.
Of what?
Lyell,
Lyell?
the geologist.
Who does?
Well, Darwin and Huxley work with Lyellism, the idea of gradual change.
Okay.
That there's no creative leaps in nature, just gradual. Yeah.
Nature does not make jumps.
We've got a question now from Dave, and then Pascal, and then Nicholas Jones, in that order. So Dave, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Anton. That was great. Thought and question. Yeah, I really appreciated, I forget which guy said it, but he was challenging Adam Smith's idea, this whole, these a priori assumptions, right? He's saying we should have evidence. There should actually be reasons presented for why this is true, rather than accept these kind of Delphic explanations. And we've talked a lot about this over the years, but I was thinking about it when I did my presentation 2 weeks ago. It's really this Aristotelian poison of just a priori assumptions. There's all these assumptions that people have, and we're just sort of believing them and then creating this whole world system based on it, but they're rarely ever challenged, the underlying assumptions, which is what these guys were doing with somebody like Smith. How do we know what Smith is saying is true? Where's the evidence for this? And so with that said, I just wanted to know if you could say something about your research methods in terms of, you know, you talk a lot about a lot of scoops that you got. Can you maybe say something in terms of, you know, were there any particular routes of investigation that were fruitful for you? Like, where did you mentioned, maybe going into the archives, or, how did you go about doing research for this? Can you say something on that?
It starts with the hypothesis that the good is a unified is a unity in the universe and among mankind and in history. So good results. First of all, you have to start with a firm adherence to the idea of progress as good. That's not a given. But if you have technological progress, which means the uplift of mankind and his condition, not video games, instead of playing Monopoly at home with your friends and family, that's not an upgrade, right? But technological progress as good, if you have then the notion of the good as being a unity, you know in advance that you're going to find a reason why good things happened. And therefore, if you look, you begin to get a sense of how to do this as you make, as this happens again and again. If you look under any positive development in history, the thing that was said about Lyell, they want to talk about gradual things. Well, but the reality is that nature does make leaps. So that's true in looking at the good that's produced. So you find a characteristic intervention or quality of mind or life behind any good development in history and in technology. If you don't find it, then there's some mistake in the way the history has been passed down to you, and you can find that. So really, I guess this whole thing for me goes back to Plato's method and what we were able to understand about history from that there's a higher good and that is effective throughout the universe. It's not simple, but it always has some element of, really, to tell the truth, there's always some element of humor or irony involved. And the proving of the account that's passed down is totally ridiculous. So if you look up any good person, why is that person a good person? Well, first of all, human nature is good. Beyond that, is there something great or a spark in that person's life? It's usually not very hard to find that. Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, was, where did he come from? He's a bright boy, but he's also taken in hand by a deeply philosophical clergyman down in the islands, who's in a war against Calvinistic determination, determinism, and for free the free will. And he's the one who gets him into the United States and gets him into the American Revolution. There's a whole field of Republican activity and a movement and a legacy that people involved in these things are aware of themselves, just like we're aware of it. If you read the original writings of these guys, you find more and more that they're aware of what what's happening, what the enemy is doing. I think we have an advantage in certain ways, despite our disadvantages of suppression of knowledge, but we have the advantage of archives being available to us. So we can look up things that are very cogent, that have good quotes and so forth. But the collection of letters, you can go into the archives, all the letters of Hamilton and Franklin and all these other people, these scientists in many cases. It's a little harder with the enemy because they burn their papers all the time. But when you get the hang of this thing, it's not hard at all. It always works out, it seems. Go find somebody. Think of a hero to you in the realm of culture or science or politics, and look in the biography, look in the life, look in the work, and you'll find things that nobody seems to have reported that are beautiful and show the previous accounts to be ridiculously shallow. You can always do that. That needs to be done for every country. You know, I've had the good fortune to work with people in Canada that have done that a lot for Canada. I've had the same good fortune in Australia. But in many countries, it hasn't been done in their country. They have heroes, but they don't, it's not based on this kind of idea of improvement, universal improvement. It's more political in a bad sense. It's just politics instead of nation building and improvement. So that's what you asked is an absolutely key question in the whole thing.
Thank you. We have one question now coming in from Pascal and then Jerry. No, sorry, Pascal, then we have Nick Jones and then Jerry. If anybody else wants to pose a question, just do what everyone else. Basically type in your name and your desire in the chat area. So Pascal?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Anton. I was thinking as you were going through, you know, your basically all of the chapters of your new book, The Table of Contents. I was thinking again about the 1800 election and how at that time, I know you had written articles on that, so I wanted to pick your brain on how you see that these elections, since you've done more work on that period and the different characters, especially when you mentioned Jefferson. I'm intrigued by that, and I know that Hamilton had to side with Jefferson for the presidential bid against Aaron Burr, and you know we know what happened after that.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could actually shed more light on that period, because I think it's such a dramatic time, and it was right at the beginning of the American Republic, so it was really in its infancy, and it was really like it was a very dangerous time, since you mentioned also the Irish rebellion or revolt, and all of the different Republican circles that were going on at that time. But I'm more interested about the 1800 elections, if you could say some words.
Okay, so there had been two previous presidents, Washington and Adams, John Adams, father of John Quincy. The Adams presidency, one term, 1797 to 1801. He lost his bid for a second term in 1800. His presidency was still carried on many of the economic policies of Washington and Hamilton, but it was in many ways an unsuccessful presidency. And there was the two-party system going on, an attack against him, and they passed laws like the sedition law that forbid criticism of the government. And it opened the way for Jefferson and his friends to carry out attacks against the program of the government. Hamilton was out of the government at this point and no longer Treasury Secretary. And he thought that Adams was a poor president and was not, his leadership was a disaster. And so he wrote a pamphlet attacking Adams as we went into the election of 1800, so that Adams, the Federalist Party candidate, the Federalists were split for and against Adams, and the Jeffersonians were able to gain an advantage from that. Many of the supporters of Jefferson were honest people who thought that but not very deep in terms of their appreciation of the strategy of Washington and his friends, like neutrality. Why did America keep neutral against with respect to England and France and their wars? Because our primary goal was the development of the United States, and we were too weak to get involved in another war. Matthew Carey was a leader of the exile community of Irishmen in the United States. He was also connected to people back in Dublin who were involved in rebelling against British rule, and as he had been when he was there. There was a rebellion again in 1798 in Ireland. So he went with Jefferson and supported Jefferson's election. Then there were other people like Aaron Burr and Gallatin who were sponsors of Jefferson's party. And they were both tied into Shelburne's apparatus. And I go in detail into that in the book, as I did in the treason book. The key place was in New York, where the Bank of Manhattan was set up by Aaron Burr, and that was used as an election funding mechanism. It was a complete scam. It's supposed to be a water project, and they got fine print in the company charter that allowed it to be a bank. That was the birth of the Bank of Manhattan, of the Chase Manhattan Bank and Morgan Chase Bank of today. So the election resulted in a tie in the Electoral College between the Jefferson and Burr because of the way the Constitution was originally written. They had to change it later to avoid this. There were no parties in the Constitution. There's no ticket. So people voted for the two top vote getters, and the top one became president, the second one became vice president. And then it went to the Congress, and Burr tried to snatch the presidency away from his partner, Jefferson, and Hamilton intervened to stop that. But what's not present in the discussion, the historical discussions of this era, is the underlying program, which is necessary, that the country has no future, no possible future at all without this program going through. It would have ended unless this revival happened quickly, as it did in the 18 teens and 20s. So the presidency of Jefferson, 1801 to 1809, was free trade, no development. He did not take down the government, the federal government, as president, largely because his party consisted of patriots as well as populist, scoundrels and Southern slave owners. So he had a national base, and he was content to just leave the country as an agrarian backwater. So I think that's what I would say about that election.
Okay, the next person in queue for questions is Nick Jones. Nick.
Hey, Anton, thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask, drawing on what you said before about good results are not separate from one another, and but rather like a continual principle of progress over lengths of time, it kind of stimulated a thought about the event that happened on July the 4th in Russia. If you were considered the renewal of that constitution as like a re-declaration of independence from the neoliberal system of free trade, and the kind of symbolism of how it was brought into institution on July 4th, and that nothing is coincidental in events in politics, and yeah, just what your thoughts are on the significance of that and the strategic element of it worldwide.
I would go back to me, the most important thing is how screwed up the United States is right now. Not to recognize their friends. We had this in Vietnam when the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh made a Declaration of Independence modeled on the American Declaration of Independence, and appealed for American help to set up an independent country. And they actually said, we'll model our independence on the Philippines. You could come in and guide us. And the Anglo-American gangsters that had took control after the death of Roosevelt turned him down. They would rather have him go to the communists than go against imperial rule. So American interests did not figure in that at all. The United States has no present concept of its own influence in the world historically.
Yeah.
So that's what I have to say about this. I have this section that I have about the railroad in Russia is a lot of fun, because it's the U.S. and Russia as allies, with Nicholas I as the Emperor of Russia, the Tsar, and the American engineer George Washington Whistler goes there, and he becomes a favorite of the Tsar, who's trying to use him to modernize the country. And they have to cope with not just with the British, but with the aristocracy, the feudal aristocracy, and their notions of class and so forth.
Yeah.
So everything that can be done to stimulate American acceptance and knowledge about our background. Why were we successful? How did that happen? That's what we need, and that's where the friends are. When you get, I was talking about the international rule over Britain, the empire that ruled Britain and rules Britain today and rules the US today. When you have truly sovereign leadership and sovereign governance in a country, which makes the country self-governing, the idea of the public benefit is the program. And as soon as that happens, the idea being universal becomes applied to other countries. And so therefore, you have again an international idea for your country, but it's in the opposite direction. So you're doing things for the benefit of other countries, and you're excited about their progress.
Right.
No country, no history is ever local. If you go back thousands and thousands of years, there's no such thing as local history. It's always global. Yeah, anyway.
So sorry, just to ask another question, drawing on what you just said, because it fits so nicely. Like, what do you make of what Boris Johnson was saying the other day about how he referenced the New Deal and Roosevelt in his speech in, I don't know if you saw it, but he did a speech in Dudley in the UK where he put heavy reference on the New Deal and spoke about Britain needing a New Deal and to raise the platform for the entire society. The actual number of investment he mentioned was obviously not big enough, but he actually fired the civil service director the other day. I can't remember his first name, but his surname is Sidwell, and he's a key component of the intelligence apparatus that needed to be gotten rid of, and is partly the reason why Britain's reaction to the COVID pandemic was so sloppy. Yeah, just wanted to draw. Yeah.
I mean, so he nearly died, right?
Yeah.
So that's a cogent reason for doing things that are positive, right?
Yeah.
Near-death experience. But that's true about our civilization. It's pretty scary, right? We could lose our human civilization. And so you can't go back to the failed system. So I don't know. I haven't followed Boris Johnson. I've seen this, started off really bad, but I don't know what does he say about Russia? I don't even know about that, or China.
I mean, when Putin made the call for the 5 leaders summit, his initial reaction was good, and it hasn't changed yet. But of course, there's many agents around him that will be trying to, obfuscate that.
So our headline is Boris Johnson joins the Labour Party and Labour Party leadership leaves the Labour Party?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great paradox.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anton.
Yeah.
Yeah. For our next question, we have Jerry, who's on the list.
Yes, hello. Hi, Tony.
Hi.
I wanted to ask you about, you were talking about this meeting between Jefferson and Madison.
Yes.
Madison gets turned. Because I remember reading that, like during the Constitutional Convention, Madison was working with Hamilton, and I think he even wrote some of the Federalist Papers, a few of them.
Yes.
And because some of the work I was doing, I know originally President Washington, he used to get Madison to kind of write his speech as sort of a draft. And at a certain point, he said he don't trust Madison anymore. And after that, it was always Hamilton who wrote his speeches. So I was just wondering what year or what period was this meeting with Jefferson and Madison when he turned Madison?
It was right at the point, I can't, my old brain is a little tired here, but it's either 70, 90, or 91. It was the first policy fight of Hamilton where he is concentrating to begin with in his program on what we're going to do with the Revolutionary War debts. And he was saying, let's pay them off at face value. And Madison came in to attack him on that and said, we have to worry about the poor soldier who had to sell his bonds, his Revolutionary War bonds, when they weren't worth very much to speculators. And now you're going to say, we'll pay them off at face value. He should get the money, not the speculator who bought. So he's posing as a populist defender of the poor soldier. So this meeting of Jefferson and Madison occurred just before that. Jefferson had come back to the United States from France. He landed in Virginia. The capital of the country was in New York at that time. It was the first temporary capital. It was in 1789, going into 1790. I think this meeting occurred probably right at the end, around Christmas of 1789. Jefferson goes to his plantation. He's surrounded, it's on a hill. Monticello means a small mountain in Italian. It's a pretty house, but he has hundreds of slaves, and he's surrounded by the gentry of his relatives, like the Randolphs and other close families who are in this clique that runs Virginia at that point, who are into a panic of anti-nationalism. And so Jefferson there works on Madison for several days. Madison came down there from New York partly at the request of Washington, who said, go to Jefferson and get him to accept the post of Secretary of State. The other three cabinet members were already in the cabinet. Henry Knox for war, and Edmund Randolph, Jefferson's cousin, as Attorney General, and Hamilton was in as Treasury Secretary. So Madison goes down there, and Jefferson works on this concept of, we should not have a national debt. We should pay off the national debt right away. Don't fund it. That is, don't set up a fund to pay the interest and then make these bonds converted into a form of money. Don't do that. Any national debt is a burden on future generations. And he said that he had been working on this concept when he was in France. Yeah, I'm sure he was. He was working on this with the British underground intelligence people that are guiding him there, that he's in with. It's very nasty. This is really nasty stuff. I have two quotes from Jefferson in this period, or one quote from this period and one later. The one from this period, he says, it is rumored that the British are guiding the anarchism in the French Revolution, that they're paying people to do the dirty work here. And that's not true. There's no truth to that. I've seen the mobs in action. They're wonderful. What they're doing is all for the best. French lives matter, or whatever they might want to say. and so then there's another quote later on in 1815, after he was out of presidency, when pro-British people in Massachusetts were attacking him, and he said, these people are paid by the British, just like the Jacobins were in France. So I have these two quotes from him, and you see how much of a goddamn liar he was in this period. He's a crafty guy, totally dishonest person in this period. He abandoned his earlier principled stance against slavery and worked to perpetuate the slave system by denying the transformation of the economy against this feudalist and imperial system. That's what happened. And Washington thought that Madison and also James Monroe had become puppets of Jefferson and never forgave Jefferson for this. Monroe later changed his mind in the positive direction. He became more of a nationalist.
That you're referring to his work with John Quincy Adams later, or
who? Monroe?
Yeah.
Well, Monroe became Secretary of state and secretary and acting secretary of war during the War of 1812. He was the war leader. And he adopted more and more pro-national points of view, not completely, but he appointed nationalists to his cabinet, like John Quincy Adams and Calhoun and so forth, and worked with Clay in the Congress, and they got these measures through while he was president, like the Survey Act to allow the Army engineers to do civil engineering with private companies, and the high tariff of 1824. So he was, and he and his family were acting behind the scenes for the nationalists against the enemy. They knew exactly what the enemy was up to in New York and in Virginia. I go into that enemy operation in real detail. The clique that ran Virginia, later known as the Richmond Junto, and the clique that ran New York after the power of DeWitt Clinton faded away, which is a machine set up by Aaron Burr and then continuous into the rule of Martin Van Buren.
Okay,
By the way, a Canadian, William Lyon Mackenzie, wrote a devastating biography of Martin Van Buren to expose him as a complete criminal. It's a very interesting story.
Yeah, on your suggestion, I bought that book on Amazon for like $25, and it was a really worthwhile purchase. His assessment of Aaron Burr and the whole battle against Hamilton was really on point, and his sense the takeover of the kitchen cabinet under Jackson and Van Buren was. I hadn't seen anything like that until EIR material came out hundreds of years later. It's really quite astounding. Okay, so the next person we have a question coming in from is Kathleen, and then Luke has a question too. Kathleen, I know you wrote your question, but why don't you go ahead and just speak it out loud?
Yes. In doing family history research, can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see you.
No, you can't. No, because I don't have the video on.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Okay, but my question is, and it's part of doing family history research. My family came to Canada just after the War of 1812, and they settled in Canada from America.
Oh, uh-huh.
And in doing this research, of course, I learned that our clan was very involved in the American Revolution as financiers and ethical aspects of this revolution. And in the chat, I just put a little link that there's an awful lot of detailed information in there, but just from the top, it's easy to see that there's Patrick Tracy, but it's his son Nathaniel Tracy that was major financier of that revolution. And so anyway, I was wondering in the course of your, pardon me?
What's the name?
Nathaniel Tracy.
Nathaniel Tracy.
Nathaniel.
Yes, Nathaniel, I think, right?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
No. Perhaps I'm pronouncing
Where did he live?
So he lived in Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's a Massachusetts name. Go ahead.
Yeah, he had the house where the library is now. There's a library, I think. So anyway, I was just wondering, in doing research myself through this period, I mean, it's so confusing, and to find, there was still, I believe, around the War of 1812, of course, there was a lot of, different sides to these arguments, and so pro or against the revolution, and then the War of 1812 coming, et cetera, and there was so much confusion in that. I find it really difficult to sort it out, but I was just wondering if in your research, if you happen to come across any information on these people. They came from Ireland. Patrick came from Ireland. I forget what year, but it's very clear when you open up that link I put. So Ireland, which I'll be really interested in reading about, and it's a small world after all.
Send me a few facts about this family that lived in Massachusetts, and maybe I could look them up.
Yeah, I'm gonna make sure. I'll make Anton's. Are you okay with your email, I guess, available to everybody on the call?
Yes.
Okay, I'll make that available. I'll make Anton's email available, as well as any references, Anton, that you might suggest that people want to follow up on after this class. I'll put them under the video link on YouTube, as well as in an email, so that people can do some extra reading of things you might recommend or watching. Okay.
I think there's a lot of really useful, detailed information here that, you know, everyone, you know, anyone interested in this aspect of history would probably find interesting, or connect some dots there, you know.
Thank you, Kathleen. Very cool. Very cool.
And
right.
Thank you for the presentation.
What's that?
Thank you for the presentation.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, we've got Luke with a question in his belly that's got to come out. So Luke, go for it. You got a mic. Your mic needs to be on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So Anton, I'm referring to a class. We mentioned it this morning at the beginning. Sorry, the British Empire wants you to be stupid. I don't know if you remember that you gave this allocution in March 26, 1994.
That's a long time ago.
But in the
Before
beginning,
you were born, right?
No, not me. I was born before that, but
okay.
Maybe some others.
Okay.
I just have vague questions from my experience listening to it. One of them, you start the conference making reference to your dad, and that he had initiated a boycott. And so I'm curious if you could just reiterate or explain the context as you remember it. And on the second fold, my question is, in this presentation, at one point you mentioned how the psychology is controlled by a group in London. And I don't know if that's, I may have misinterpreted, but I'm trying to—
Talking about the Tavistock Institute, or what are you talking about?
Yes, there's some kind of, you introduce some kind of serial killers that are killing.
Oh yeah.
And then you—
Well, that was, yeah. Well, I'll try to sum this up pretty quickly. In 1933, both Franklin Roosevelt and Hitler took over in their respective countries. My father was a Jewish immigrant from Latvia, who was born in 1898 and came to this country in 1909 as a little boy. And in the 1920s, he was a lawyer in New York City. And he was a Roosevelt Democrat. And so he was very interested in doing something against Hitler. There was at that time a combination of Wall Street and London banking concerns centered on both not only Morgan, but also Harriman Bank, which was Brown Brothers Harriman, which is Brown Brothers is in London and New York, and also Kuhn Loeb, which is a Jewish firm in London and New York. The Warburgs were in that. And all of these firms were closely associated with the British establishment and London banking. And all of them were involved in the financing of the Hitler establishment and the Hitler dictatorship and the Nazi Party and industrial enterprises building up the Nazi war machine. all the way up through into the middle of the 1930s. 1933, my father was hired by a boycott instituted by the American Jewish Congress and the American Federation of Labor. They were not part of the American CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, before the AFL-CIO. But so these two groups started a boycott against Germany right after Hitler took over. My father was hired as a legal counsel and strategist for that boycott. And he instituted lawsuits, not directly connected to the boycott, but lawsuits representing clients in New York who held bonds on German private companies that were now under the control of Hitler. One of them was this big, huge steamship company, the North German Lloyd, that was jointly owned by the Hitler government and these Wall Street banks, particularly Brown Brothers Harriman. George Bush's, the first George Bush president's father was a managing partner in that enterprise in New York and was involved with financing Hitler directly. So my father took the case of these people who were bondholders. His first client was a lady in the Bronx in New York who had a $1,000 bond on this steamship company. And according to a Hitler decree, that company was not allowed to pay her $30 that she was owed on interest on that bond. My father took her as a client and got a 30,000-ton German ship, the passenger liner, the Europa, tied up in New York City until they would pay this debt of $30 to that client. And he went in, the opposing lawyer in that case was John Foster Dulles. The future Secretary of State. He and his brother Alan, the future head of CIA, were both the main intermediaries between the Wall Street companies, the London banks, and the Hitler government. John Foster Dulles personally went to Berlin to organize the bailing out of the German Nazi government from their credit difficulties with Schacht, who was partly his protege. Their big partner in all of this was Montague Norman, the head of the Bank of England, who had instituted the first fascist regime in Europe back in 1920 in Austria, before Mussolini and before Hitler. So Montague Norman was a real thumping fascist. He was also a theosophist and an insane person. He was involved in all the clubs and all the imperial nonsense. But at the end of the war, he was head of the Bank of England for 20 years, much longer than anybody else ever was. His grandfather had been head of the Bank of England and was also a partner in Brown Brothers, which is a stinking transatlantic firm. So at the end of the war, he left in some disrepute for people that didn't like Hitler in 1944. And there were a lot of people who didn't like Hitler in England, for sure. So he left the bank and he became the head of a new organization, the World Federation for Mental Health.
That's Montague Norman.
Yeah, particularly ironic for him because he was insane, you know, and he believed that he could walk through walls, but he just chose not to. Things like this. So they worked with the Rockefeller Foundation, with the Scottish Rite Masons, with a lot of very strange people, and British perverts who were in the military service and who were doing torture. This is way before the CIA. You know, so this is a continuum from the Hitler days into the period after World War II, when this whole Anglo-American and later Five Eyes network gets set up. Montague Norman is at the center of all this stuff. And the people in his circle in the city of London. I have a later article about the coup against Kennedy involving Allen Dulles that goes into this whole intelligence apparatus. So that my father was anti-Wall Street from that standpoint, and I got it was a good heritage for me. He wasn't involved directly in politics when I was growing up. He died in 1955 when I was only 12 years old, but I subsequently found out a lot about him. But he had a classical mind from this whole kind of background. And I used to be taken to Beethoven quartets when I was a little boy. He taught at part-time at Caltech in Pasadena, where I grew up. So he taught scientific Russian and business law. He was in Army intelligence during World War II. He told us he was doing weather analysis. He was very much interested in science, so it might have been true. It also might have just been fake. I don't know.
Would that have been with the OSS?
No, Army Air Corps intelligence. He was stationed in Washington.
Thank you very much.
He spoke Russian and German both as almost like native languages. He's from Latvia.
Latvia.
Yeah.
All right, so next up I have one question by Randy, and Pascal. I know, and Pascal has a second follow-up question if time permits. Anton, how are you doing for time right now?
I was just looking at the clock, but I'm okay for now, but
okay.
Can't
right,
be too long.
Okay, so let's, Randy, I know you haven't asked the question yet, so why don't you go ahead and then we'll let Pascal ask his follow-up question.
Thanks, I'll try and keep it fairly quick. Anton, you mentioned 7 professors that signed a petition regarding the revocation of the German Constitution.
Hanover Constitution, yeah.
Hanover Constitution, making the citizens subjects to, I guess, the monarch. And when you said that, it brought to my mind the Windsor family actually being the House of Saxe-Coburg von Gotha or something along those lines.
Yeah.
And how World War I is actually thought to have been, or subtitled, the War of the Three Cousins.
Right.
So, in the you made sort of an allusion towards the city of London being a center of leadership or action of the banking cartel, but it's actually taking orders from somewhere else.
Not exactly. I mean, it's a center that is established to exert the power of an oligarchy that's broader than England, put it that way. A lot of this power is stationed in Holland. A lot of the dirty aspects of imperialism come from the Dutch, the enemies of Rembrandt, the enemies of the Renaissance, and the enemies of Erasmus. I shouldn't even say Dutch, really. I should say Amsterdam and this banking operation, the empire. Again, it's the empire ruling over and exerting control over the good people of Holland who did this revolt against the Habsburgs. But the city of London became a great power based on secret societies set up over a few centuries, but they became very important in the 1600s. These became known as these, they're not guilds, they're the worshipful company of mercers, the worshipful company of carpenters, the worshipful company of fishmongers. They're sort of like Masonic groups, but they are trade groups with international connections and more money and power, a lot, and covert activities. They fund the monarchy, and the monarchy depends on them. And so in the 1600s, you have the Bank of England set up by a lot of international characters, a lot of them from Holland. Just like the British monarch came from Holland, William the Third, right? And his wife and so forth. So this, and John Locke came over with that. He had gone over to Holland. So the city of London then in the 1600s became rich from crime, just straight out crime. African slavery, the Royal African Company, and the East India Company imposing their rule on areas to the east of the Cape of Good Hope. Was that called? Yeah, Cape of Good Hope, in the East Africa eastward. And the proceeds of looting and crime and murder. The same thing can be said of Wall Street in a little bit later period, where they were brokers for the slave cotton. But the Bank of England was set up to finance the wars of the monarchy, and to keep stability to some extent for this looting. It wasn't for the benefit of English society, but it was a private organization based on a lot of international characters in France and these French-speaking Genevans and Amsterdam, as well as the East India people inside of England and aristocrats in England.
There was, just to say a word on that point too, a few years ago in 2008, I had the privilege of working on a little team to make a documentary that was produced by LPAC called The New Dark Age. And in it, I'll make that available too in the email after this class. It pretty much features a story of how the ruling families and cults, which also ran the finances in so many ways of ancient Rome, migrated parasitically with Rome's collapse to Byzantine. Some of them set up in Venice and simply moved their base of operations into new geographical terrain, but doing the exact same thing, managing mystery religions, mystery synthetic cults that they always used to get their victims to basically fight each other and destroy each other for the benefit of the masters, which then moved later on from Venice into Amsterdam, and then from there into England to set up the Bank of England. But it's a nice little well-composed documentary, and I'll share that. I think it's a good complement to Anton's class.
You know, I just, let me say one thing.
Yeah.
This story about Venice, Amsterdam, and London cannot be understood only in the dimension of the evil of these guys. In every case, they are acting against a great power of creativity in England and in Amsterdam and in Italy that we know about, right? The Renaissance monarchs and other leaders in the Renaissance. So that is where even though we are a minority, we are outsiders. We are weak, we are small. But that's how every progress has been made, by outsiders. Everybody's an outsider and in a tension with the great powers, but that's where the progress has been made. And I liken that to the small seed that becomes great in science. And you think about a baby, that's just a couple of cells to begin with, and who, it's not to be noticed, but then it becomes a great individual. And the whole human race has been created to care for and nurture that little baby. Our whole biological nature, all of our instincts, all of our love. So it's a great force, even though it's weak and small. So that's important in history in this way. Don't start with the enemy, start with the Renaissance.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Pascal, as promised, you have your follow-up question. Go for it.
Yeah, okay, sure, thanks. I'm really glad that you answered that question with your input at the end concerning the good versus the evil. And that made me think about, I was thinking about it for a long time since, yesterday, as you know, was the 4th of July. And again, there are these things that are mentioned as kind of mantras. Everybody knows this, everybody knows that. And in that case, it came up that, everybody knows the American Revolution really was inspired by John Locke. And every time I hear that, I kind of have to, knock myself out to try to forget it.
Yeah.
That people are mentioning that, but I think that your book is going to be kind of like an antidote to that kind of thinking that has been, spread around by the enemy. And I think that, really the way that you've approached this question on how we have to define progress and history is really fundamental to real understanding. And I was just thinking about, how Leibniz is influenced around the world at the time, and how Ben Franklin, followed in the footsteps and to create the first modern republic in the United States. And I'm always shocked, even though, I shouldn't maybe, but it's always something that irritates me that people, bring back John Locke. And so I just wanted to share that with you. It's not exactly a question, but I wanted to know if you had comments on that.
Well, there's a book written about that called The Anti-Newtonian Roots of the American Revolution by Philip Valenti. And you can go online and get a copy of it. He also published a book about Logan that he did he wrote, anyway, James Logan. But look it up, Valenti, Valenti, V-A-L-E-N-T-I, Phil Valenti, Philip. The Anti-Newtonian Roots of the American Revolution, about Leibniz and Franklin and the fight against Newton. Very useful. I haven't gone into, I just barely touched on Leibniz in this book. And I had to make a decision about going with what I know about and can prove, and what I can bring out in a limited period as well. So I do reference Leibniz, and I also reference Louis LaRouche as an expert on the Leibniz at one point in the book. But I haven't gone deeply into the prior philosophy of the humanists, pro and anti-empiricism and so forth. I do reference that. I go into John Quincy Adams versus Bentham on this. But I recommend Valenti's book on the history of this fight with Franklin in particular.
Is this available? This is a book by Valenti?
Yes.
Okay, is this available on Amazon or something?
I think, here, wait a minute. Here it is.
I've never seen that in my life.
Huh.
Look it up. It's available. It's in libraries around Philadelphia.
Huh. Okay.
But you can, I think you can order it. Go on Amazon. You can get anything on Amazon, right?
That's amazing. Thank you for bringing that one up. I'll make sure that that's available in the description of the video too. Sam. Oh, by the way, before Sam, because Sam's gonna ask a question. Before he does, I just want to say too, Graham Lowry's wonderful book, How the Nation Was Won, is something I've read a couple of times. Cynthia's read it a couple of times, and it's just every single time there's so many new discoveries and insights that are made, which deals with the 1630 to 1752 period. That people have to understand if they want to get what happened in 1776. They can't understand it without this process that deals with the humanist networks of Robert Harley, Jonathan Swift, and all of these other anti-Newtonian political networks and scientists in Europe who collaborated with Cotton Mather, John Winthrop Jr., Ben Franklin. So that book as well is something which is a must read before before I was going to say before you die, but let's not be so morose.
Graham Lowry's son,
yeah,
Colin Lowry, is currently working on some really brilliant material about the anti-slavery crusade in the colonial days by the Americans.
Fantastic.
In conflict with the British government.
That's something that's important to.
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay, so Sam, just so people know, Sam Libriere is a close friend, an engineer in Toronto who will be delivering next week's lecture, going from some of the French networks of Colbert, Vattel, to Benjamin Franklin, and touching on a bit of Hamilton too next week. So for those who want to extend this lesson to yet another dimension, tune in next week at 4 o'clock for Sam's class. But Sam, what did you have in mind? What do you want to say?
I was going to say...
Ooh, Sam, you got to speak louder.
Also, there will be quite a bit on Leibniz as well. So we were talking about Leibniz before. So yeah, hope to see you there. I just wanted to say thank you to Tony for doing this today. I really appreciated his time and learning all this stuff. Treason in America. It's my favorite book. Whenever I go on a flight, I bring whatever I'm reading now and Treason in America in case I get bored for the first one, because I always enjoy reading it. And I'm really looking forward to this new book. I'll definitely be putting in a pre-order for the paperback whenever it's available. So please please let us know.
Great.
And when I was in school, in engineering, I took a history elective. I have a history degree actually prior to engineering. But after my history degree, I encountered the LaRouche movement through Matt actually. And I took a class on the Civil War as an elective, and for the final paper did a study on the Times of London reactions to Lincoln's economic policies. So it's all primary sources from the Times editorials, and I'd be happy to share it with you if
I'd love to see that.
Like any of it.
You wrote about that's your paper?
That's right. Yeah, that was the final paper.
I'd love to see that.
I'll send it over to your email.
Okay, great.
Hey, Sam, would you mind that being made more publicly available, or is that something you'd rather?
No problem. Yeah, no problem.
Yeah? Okay, great. Send it to me too. Okay, so I think that rounds out today's lecture very nicely.
Good.
Anton, thank you so very much for taking the time and sharing your wisdom with us. And I think we're all looking forward to pre-ordering that book and volume 2 when that comes out as well. So, huh?
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Inshallah. All right. See you, Anton. Thank you, everybody, for taking the time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Anton.
Cheers. Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.